Ladies and gentlemen, this is Track Bro here. Today I decided to make a more technically sound video for you guys. This is the Toyota 2JZ versus the Nissan VR38DETT. TT, sorry. So really what I came to the conclusion based off my recommendations and YouTube recommendations is that this is content that I think a lot of people would enjoy. I recently watched a podcast where basically it was just two guys bickering about which engine is faster and so on and so forth. And they were more so talking about the drama between the two dragsters, I should say, than the actual engines. And I found it to be pretty redundant. Like it's really just basic, like Wikipedia, 1, 2, 3, what does the engine does to me type content, and really basic stuff. So I decided that I would make an actual video that would go through kind of the technical side of tuning both these engines. And really what I think it is this is the JDM battle of this century. Last century would have been more like the 2JZ and the RB. This century I think the VR38 kind of took the RB's pants and is wearing it for it right now. So let's first start with, why did I choose these engines? Why didn't I choose, for instance, the B58 to replace the 2JZ? Or why did I not choose the RB26 instead of the VR38? And, even maybe the VQ. I'll talk about that for a sec here. So the first thing is B58. I think the B58 overall is way too young. Firstly, the B58 only came out in around 2014, and we only really knew how good they became around 2016, 2017. And at that point, they were really only in M240i's with the automatic transmission. The transmission was a pain in the ass to actually get it to work with it. So we only really figured out how good they were through the Supra, the Mark V Supra. And the problem is that platform is completely different than the M240i in terms of like what you can do with it and how it kind of works for not even the main engine, but just kind of the secondary stuff, the cooling, the transmission cooling, and the oil system and so on and so forth. All of that is still being figured out, and so because of that, there isn't really all that many Supras that are taking the streets. There's maybe like a handful, or maybe like two handfuls of Mark V Supras that are really kicking it off right now, and for good reason. I mean, these things are still under warranty. There's not really a reason to completely violate these cars for most people, and they're not really interested in making all that much power either. They're not really like power havers type cars, in my opinion. So it's totally makes perfect sense. On top of that, they're just like everywhere, really. Like you could get them pretty much in all platforms. And a lot of the Beamer boys, they prefer using the S58, which is currently very popular with the M3 and M4s, and also with the X5s. If you didn't know, the X5Ms have them. So it wouldn't really surprise me that like the B58 is going to be forgotten over the S58 and also the S55. Like that thing is an absolute beast, and people are still learning what to do with it. So again, it's got a lot of competition, and it's just too young right now. There's not really that many kits you could use. So now the RB26. Why didn't we choose the RB26? Like technically, it has more parts for it. More people know what to do with it. Well, really, it comes down to the RB26 is not that popular in North America. Now, I know the YouTubes, the Instagrams, and stuff like that make you feel as though it is, but the thing is and the truth is that most of the Instagram videos that you've seen of all those like R32s, R33s, and R34 GTRs in the States are usually actually RB25s, which are lower flowing. They just don't make the same power, and usually the blocks are weaker as well, or they're also potentially non-turbos, so they're not even really worth talking about in general senses. They're just really like they're lookers. They're like kind of like all for show, posers, you could say. The really cool ones actually come out from Asia, but specifically Australia. Like Australia just kicks it off with the RB26s. They take blocks from trucks like the Nissan Patrol, and then they just build them up. They don't even need stroker kits because they come stock with our 3.0s, and yeah, they're pretty crazy with those things. And they build also crazy billet heads over there that you just can't have here, if you didn't know that. So today we're really going to be talking about 3 stages of tuning. There's going to be the street stage, which is going to be under 750 horsepower. I guess you could say crank. It doesn't really matter if it's crank or wheel. We'll talk about it a little later. And then we're going to talk kind of briefly about Pro Street, which is kind of like having a car that you can kind of drive to the drag, although most of the time you don't want to. And then Pro Drag, which is really just you need to set it up like on the spot. The chassis is really a roller, and then the engine's the whole shebang of the project. Another thing you can think of is like street is like really good for tracking. Like it'd be awesome to go on the track with it. There's some categories that you can actually race with, so if you're interested in doing that, you could definitely do that. But then Pro Street, you just basically have to go on the drag strip. There is a category for that kind of stuff, so they'll allow you for certain horsepower levels. And then Pro Drag, you basically have to enter only specific competitions. You basically need your own team. So it's not really super specific for you guys, but the higher horsepower you go, the more stages of tuning you go, the more technical it is, and also the least amount of people that it would actually interest. So it wouldn't surprise me if you don't know the secret sauce for like 2,000 horsepower, specific Nissans and specific Supras. They're just not going to tell you because that's how they make their money. So let's start with some quirks. Basically, what are the things that make these individual engines really particular, and also particular for tuning? So I guess the first thing we'll talk about real quick is the head flow on the 2JZs. So 2JZs, almost all modding, let's say, projects start with a GE. And the reason why they start with the GEs is that the GEs have slightly better flowing heads. But generally speaking, it's because they're just way more common. There's a lot more cars that had them, both in Japan and here. So when you're buying 2JZ, you might as well get the GE. It's just a little better to start with. And talking about head flow, that's a big thing that the 2JZ has over the VR, but really any other 6-cylinder platform, is that the heads flow amazingly. What does that mean? That means that from where the intake starts all the way to the valve, you need a specific amount of what they call cubic feet per meter of air, the airflow. And head flow is basically what allows the engine to suck up as much oxygen as possible in the least amount of time. It also has to do with resistance, so like you can calculate it in pounds, and also PSI. And head flow really allows to be as efficient as possible in terms of with your air, and so that becomes a really good indicator of big power engines when it comes to turbo engines, because turbos would have to push in less PSI of boost for your head, based off your head. So porting heads and also cams somewhat will affect the efficiency of your turbos, and so the bigger you start with, the better it is for you in the future. So really, like, the big thing you could think of here is that 2JZs are diesel-like. They're built like diesels. They are pretty much bulletproof. You can basically just plump on a bigger turbo and it'll take it most of the time. But the big thing is just like diesels, you need to have supporting mods that will hold on the power. So for instance, head studs, that's a very important mod, both with diesels and 2JZs. Head gaskets, and supporting mods again, like internally, like connecting rods, and of course cooling, oil cooling specifically, because again it's a big iron block. Iron blocks are not that great for cooling, so you do need a lot better cooling just out of the bat. Especially, you could think of it this way also. You're starting with NA block, your pump is not going to do anything if you're putting on a turbo, so definitely do that. But what's cool is that most of the internals are, from what I heard, are forged with the NA blocks, so the NA internals, so you really don't have to do all that much to start off, and we'll get into that in a sec. But what's really cool with the heads is that they will go up to 1600 horsepower with basic porting with the 2JZ. So that's just proof of how good the 2JZ is. You really don't have to do all that much to get the big powers out of it, right? So that's really great. Now let's go to the VR team. Now I'm not done here, but the VR has a couple of interesting things and a couple of I guess disadvantages over the 2JZ. But it's a good thing that I chose this engine and not another one, because again, they're like kind of polar opposites in this way. With the VR38, it's extremely well built overall. There's literally no quirks that I have to really talk about, negatives that I should talk about. You know, with the 2JZ, again, it's diesel-like, so you're going to have all those quirks, including the unreliability, running turbos. But with the VR38, it is reliable for sub 700 horsepower, and that's 600 wheel horsepower. Now, here's the thing I was going to talk about earlier: crank versus wheel. Is there really a difference? Well, with the Supras, not really, because most of them are running manuals. With the VR38s, you're building the drivetrain, not just the engine. You're building the transmission and the engine, because again, all-wheel drive, dual clutch system. They get really hot. You need to cool them down and things like this. And generally speaking, also, when you're making over 600 wheel horsepower on a all-wheel drive system, just like Subarus, you got to start worrying about the drivetrain if it's going to hold down the power. So, you know, these things are really well built for sub 700 horsepower, require maybe a little bit better cooling systems, especially for the transmission if you're going to track it, but otherwise they're fine, they're great. And everything is really evened out, which is really cool, because again, these are really like highly technical engines over the 2JZ, right? 2JZ's diesel. This is more like, again, the Terminator, like a Terminator engine, or like some sort of like technical, I don't know, like some sort of like futuristic engine, right? So they're actually plasma sprayed with something called Wustite. Wustite is kind of like an iron spray, and that replaces what you would usually have like seals. And that will be pretty useful in a little future here, where we're going to talk about porting the heads. Sorry, not the heads. The internals, which is really just boring and stroking. We'll talk about that in a sec. But another thing is that from the stock, you get great turbos, really good turbos, and that's one of the advantages that the GTR has over the Supra, is that in the Supra's time, we were kind of running like older turbos that weren't really that efficient overall. And but around the 2008's time, there were some patents that came out of military that allowed for turbines to get a lot more efficient, and compressors to get a lot more efficient, and so the Nissans got that kind of technology that trickled down onto it. So that made it really good from the factory. And you know, you see a compressor here. Well, we're going to talk about that in a sec. Basically, changing out the compressor, basically using stock turbos, but changing out a couple things such as inlets, and allowing for better power, and FBO making great power on stock turbos. So pretty much this is where like all the advantages kind of stop here. Everything is limited for about 850 crank. If you're doing anything over 850 crank, you're going to start bending internals very quickly. The V6s, they bend different from the the inline 6s. The inline 6s bend kind of like progressively, but the V6s, it's a whole shebang, and so it's like very uneven, or very, what would you call that, crazy when something bends. We don't know when, we don't know how or why, but we know that the V6s usually just bend out of nowhere. So you might as well be safe, don't pull that slot, and you know, basically keep it under 850 crank. I would keep it even under 700, I would say. You know, you don't need that much. It's all-wheel drive. They pull really hard from 0 to 60. Why would you need anything more? I don't know, but at least you got the information. So, big disadvantage with the VR over like the 2JZ is the exhaust port. The exhaust port is NA sized. And what that means is basically with NA motors, how the head port is, the intake is usually much bigger than the exhaust. And you know, you might be asking yourself, like, why does that matter? Well, due to some kind of like physical magics with pressures, it makes a big difference, because with NA engines, you're not putting a bunch of boost, and so it's actually good because it advances, like it naturally advances the cycle, and so you're getting that ignition much faster inside the piston than usually. So that's actually very good for power. But when you're running turbos, now you're getting the opposite effect, which is the exhaust is not pushing out the exhaust air fast enough. So that hot air stays into the combustion, and so because of that, you get a lot more heat inside the chambers when you don't want them. So even though the VR38 is made out of aluminum, which is much better to cool, and you basically don't need any real cooling, people still have to run E85 making 600 plus wheel horsepower, because otherwise the chambers would just start melting themselves. Now with if it was like, let's say like iron sealed, like it actually used seals, it would be kind of better in some ways. You would just change the seal and then there you go, try again later. But because it's plasma sprayed, you really only get one shot. Like if it overheats too much, then in terms of reliability, you're done. You got to change the whole block. There's no such thing as like a plasma sprayed factory. Like nobody's going to do that for you. You'd have to ask Nissan, right? So that's a big issue. But here I got a nice graph here beside the turbo of the difference between like a late RB26 versus versus a VR in terms of porting. So in the first, the blue and the green line here, you see that they're they're very, very similar, and that's because that's the RB26 engine, which is like twin turboed, inline six, and it's similar in terms of ratio with the 2JZ, although the 2JZ is much bigger, surprisingly, or unsurprisingly, depending who you are. With the VR38, you see the difference is drastic, and it's actually really similar to the VQ, which is, maybe because they're pretty similar, I don't know. But the thing is that most people would say, well, just port the head. Like for instance, we were looking at the 2JZ, and with a ported head, you can make 1600 horsepower, so that's really awesome. But the thing is that this is with an old school aluminum head that is not very technically advanced, kind of heavy for aluminum, and generally speaking has a lot of overhead for kind of playing around with these figures. You could just like drill right in and there you go. Kind of like, you could think of it like an old V8, although with diesels you can't do that. Okay, that's a big difference between diesels and gassers. Now, with the VR38, of course, this is a technologically advanced engine. The drivetrain was purpose built, and so that V6 head, that V6 head is like, there's not a lot of playroom for the exhaust port, and so some companies at the very high horsepowers do play a lot with the exhaust port, but they come into extreme reliability issues that cause them to basically like fail competitions. So this is where the myth of the 2000 horsepower GTRs that are unreliable kind of comes in. And so that's not 100% true, but it's because these guys are kind of playing it risky on the exhaust ports, and I don't blame them, because it would really unlock a lot of power out of these things. Like, why would Nissan ever do that? Well, that's another story. But one solution is to run a custom billet head. That's what a lot of people do in the higher horsepower ranges. We'll talk about that later. And lastly, like again, this is a fundamental problem with the GTRs over the Supras in general, is that the transmission is part of the deal. With the Supra, if you were building the 2JZ, you don't even really have to think about the transmission. It's kind of like an afterthought. Okay, do I want to use a T56 or do you want to use the Supra transmission? That's pretty much it. Nobody runs automatics with Supras. You lose way too much power, and it's just generally speaking not a good idea. It's not like your truck transmissions, which has like a billion parts and they're really cheap. So people just run manual, and that's pretty much it. And if later on down the line they want to run like a sequential or something like that, they just add it on top of the manual, and that's it. Versus with the GTRs, you start with a dual clutch. That's heavy. That's not just heavy, but it's inefficient in terms of like thermally inefficient. So you got to run coolers. Then you got to upgrade the clutch whenever you want to make a little bit more power. Next stage, you got to upgrade the clutch, because every clutch is a little different. Some clutches are way worse on the street. Some clutches are they're like featherweight, so they're just going to break over, like even stock boost pressures sometimes. So you end up with a lot of like this kind of quirky stuff that a lot of people don't like. They like the dual clutch because it's cool, and then they get into it and like, crap, like this is really expensive, and that's, you know, generally speaking, it just comes with the packaging, right? So this is what I suggest for doing a 2JZ. It's a really nice Supra here. You know, basically you start with a shell, rolling shell preferably, but you can start with like any shell really. You really hot rod it, so you just do the shell on its own, then you do the engine. The engine you put in a single turbo setup, preferably a 6.7, 6.6, but you could go bigger or you could go old school like a 6.2. And then you put in some cams because the stock cams are not really made for big turbos, especially on single turbos. Then you go with some spring retainers, which will help with basically your cams to hold on the valve longer. Then you go with some injectors, new clutch for your transmission, you know, preferably a bigger clutch, obviously. Most people just run 2 fuel pumps. They'll run 3 if they want to do E85. They'll run bigger injectors. Some people have done like 1200. Some people have done 2000 cc's right off the bat. And you can really just run the stock intake manifold on top of that, on top of the turbo setup. Really just piping, and that's pretty much it. And of course, you need some sort of exhaust system. Now, it's not as complicated as, let's say, the GTR in that case, because again, if you're running like twin turbos, you kind of have to synchronize them. So you have to buy like purpose-built exhaust. But with this setup, you really only need a header and maybe a long tube, and that's it. Everything else you can do on your own. Yeah, and then that's pretty much it.